In this video, I'll be presenting an internal case from the Bible that Isaiah chapter 9 is not about Jesus, rather it's about another figure who I'll be explaining later on in this video. Now, Isaiah chapter 9 verse 6 says, "For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace." Now, this verse is applied by Christian missionaries and apologists to Christ, and they say this is obviously about Jesus. Especially the next verse, verse 7, where it says, "Of the greatness of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness. From that time on and forever, the zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this." Now, what is the context of Isaiah chapter 9? In verse 1 it says, "Nevertheless, there will be no more gloom for those who are in distress. In the past he humbled the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, but in the future he will honor Galilee of the nations, by the way of the sea, beyond the Jordan." Basically what God is saying is that these lands in northern Israel, Galilee, Naphtali, Zebulun, these lands, God will relieve them of their historical trauma that they went through. Now, what trauma am I referring to? If we go to 2 Kings chapter 15, we see this. Specifically in verse 29, where it states that in the time of Pekah, the king of Israel, the king of Assyria came and conquered these lands like Galilee, Gilead, Naphtali, etc., and deported these people to Assyria. Now, for the Assyrians to go against Israel was God's plan all along as a punishment to the Israelites. We see this in 2 Kings chapter 17, where the Israelites go against God's commands, worship other gods and idols, and sacrifice their children, until verse 18, where it says, "So the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them from his presence." You understand? So God was really angry with the Israelites. And a few verses earlier, in verse 3 to 6, God explains how the king of Assyria went on to capture these lands and deport the Israelites to Assyria, as it says in verse 6. So in 2 Kings 15:29, it describes Israel as being attacked and the Assyrians taking them out of their lands. In 2 Kings chapter 17, in the beginning of that chapter, it describes how the Assyrians have completely destroyed the lands of northern Israel, and Israel has gone to a complete exile from the Assyrians. And if you remember, in Isaiah chapter 9 verse 1, it describes the lands of Zebulun, Naphtali, and Galilee of the nations, which were the first lands conquered by Assyria. And we get an even better understanding of what's going on in the next chapter, Isaiah chapter 10. The beginning of Isaiah chapter 10 explains God's hate against northern Israel at the time. God says, "Woe to those who make unjust laws, to those who issue oppressive decrees, to deprive the poor of their rights and withhold justice from the oppressed of my people." This is describing what the northern kingdom had become. In verse 5 and onwards, God says, "Woe to the Assyrian, the rod of my anger." So Assyria will be the rod of God's anger, in whose hand is the club of my wrath. Meaning, in the hands of the Assyrians is God's wrath. God will use the Assyrians as a tool to unleash his wrath onto the northern kingdom. "I send him against a godless nation," verse 6. So Assyria is being sent by God against the northern kingdom. And God calls Israel a godless nation. "I dispatch him against the people who anger me, to seize loot and snatch plunder," and it goes on and on. But then later on in Isaiah chapter 10, after the punishment has gone by, God decides to alleviate the punishment completely. In verse 12, it says, "When the Lord has finished his work against Mount Zion and Jerusalem, he will say, I will punish the king of Assyria for the willful pride of his heart and the haughty look in his eyes." So God sends Assyria as the rod of his anger, and then after the punishment had gone by, then God decides to punish the Assyrians and to alleviate the punishment altogether. And we find this in Isaiah chapter 9 verse 1, where God talks about these nations being in great happiness and bliss, since the punishment has been taken away and they are no longer under the Assyrian oppression. It says in Isaiah chapter 9 verse 1, "Nevertheless, there will be no more gloom for those who are in distress. In the past he humbled the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, but in the future he will honor Galilee of the nations, by the way of the sea beyond the Jordan." So God had punished them, but there will be no more gloom for these nations. So now we've got the context of Isaiah chapter 9. Verse 1 and onwards talks about how God had punished Israel by the Assyrians. And Isaiah chapter 9, in the beginning, it talks about how the Israelites will be in great joy and God will take away the punishment of the Assyrians from Israel. Verse 2 and 3 explain how these nations are in great joy and they've received a great light from God, how God has removed their oppression. Then Isaiah chapter 9 verse 4 says, "For you have broken the yoke of his burden and the staff off his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor, as in the day of Midian." Now, in the beginning it says, "For you have broken the yoke of his burden." Who is his? This would refer to the Assyrians, right? And Israel has broken the yoke of his burden, the burden of the Assyrians. We also read in Isaiah chapter 14 verse 25, the same language is used. God says that I will break the Assyrian. And God says, his yoke shall be removed, his burden removed from their shoulders. This is in Isaiah chapter 14, verse 25. This is the exact same language used. Also in Isaiah chapter 10, verse 5, it says, woe to Assyria, the rod of my anger. Then if you go back to Isaiah chapter 9, verse 4, it says, the rod of his oppressor. This refers to the rod of his oppressor being broken and taken away as in the day of Midian. For a little more context, the day of Midian was when God miraculously put an army of multitudes to flight before Gideon's small band of 300 soldiers. This is found in Judges chapter 6 and Judges chapter 7. This is a clear parallel to the miraculous annihilation of the Assyrians and how God saved Israel from their oppression. Now we move on to Isaiah chapter 9 verse 6, which is the one which the Christians use to prove that it's about Jesus. Isaiah chapter 9 verse 6 reads, for to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Now the term Mighty God, which is El Gibor in the Hebrew, is said to be referring to God, as found in Isaiah chapter 10 verse 21, where it does refer to God. But there are two interesting things to note. First of all, in Ezekiel chapter 32 verse 21, the same term is used in the plural to refer to other than God. It's used to refer to the tyrant kings who are dead. The kings of old. Each and every one of them would be mighty God, and all of them are referred to as a whole as mighty gods. Also, the New Testament authors and the disciples of Christ who are writing the New Testament read a reading of the Old Testament called the Septuagint, which is a Greek rendering of the Hebrew text. In the Septuagint, the term mighty God is not found in Isaiah chapter 9 verse 6. It simply isn't there. So the disciples of Christ and Christ himself wouldn't have been reading in Isaiah chapter 9, which called anyone mighty God within this verse. So this verse does not necessitate a divine figure. Isaiah chapter 9 verse 7 is where it gets really interesting. In the beginning of verse 7 it says, of the greatness of his government and peace there will be no end. Now the Christian will say, how can it be any other than a divine figure when there is no end to the peace? But the interesting thing is that this word does not necessitate that it's eternal or everlasting, as in Isaiah chapter 2 verse 7, it describes the lands of Judah as their land is full of silver and gold, there is no end to their treasures. Their land is full of horses, there is no end to their chariots. Obviously, a literal reading of the text will make no sense whatsoever. The same verse says something very similar a second time. It states, he will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time and forever. The word used for forever is olam in the Hebrew. The term olam can very well mean for a long period of time, rather than meaning eternity. For example, we find this in Jonah chapter 2, where Jonah describes what it was like being near death in the belly of the whale. And he says, to the roots of the mountains I sank down. The earth beneath barred me in forever. The term is forever, but we all know Jonah went on and lived. He was not barred in the earth forever. We also see the same word used in Genesis chapter 17, where God describes the covenant with Abraham as an everlasting covenant. And then it says, then God said to Abraham, as for you, you must keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you for the generations to come. This is my covenant with you and your descendants after you, the covenant you are to keep. Every male among you shall be circumcised. And in verse 7, it describes this very same covenant as an everlasting covenant. The word used is olam. Then Paul comes many years later in Galatians chapter 5 and abrogates the necessity for circumcision. In fact, he goes as far to say that being circumcised is something that makes one further from Christ. He says, mark my words, I, Paul, tell you that if you let yourselves be circumcised, Christ will be of no value to you at all. And he goes on to explain how circumcision is not the right thing to do. If circumcision really was everlasting, then Paul would be wrong. But according to Christians, the term olam cannot mean everlasting in that sense. So now we have established that verse 7 can very plausibly mean that the ruler will rule over Israel on the throne of David for a very long time. Now, verse 7 actually refutes it being Christ at all. How do we know this? Verse 7 says, and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time and forevermore. Now, this translation is wrong. It's not from that time, it's from now and forevermore. So when Isaiah is speaking, it's from now and forevermore, this justice will be made. If we can prove this actually means from now and forevermore, it cannot be referring to Christ, as this is supposed to be a prophecy according to Christians, which was fulfilled when Christ came. We have the evidence to prove that this term in the Hebrew refers to from now and onwards, from Psalms 113 verse 2 and Psalms 115 verse 18. Psalm 115 verse 18 says, it is we who extol the Lord, both now and forevermore. Psalm 113 verse 2 says, let the name of the Lord be praised, both now and forevermore. which means that from a proper reading of the text, Isaiah chapter 9 is referring to an individual who lives at the time of Isaiah. So now I'll be presenting the case for who the Son is in Isaiah chapter 9. In Isaiah chapter 9 verse 7, it uses the term, "The zeal of the Lord will accomplish this." Now remember the context with the Assyrian oppression and all that. Now it's talking about how the Assyrian oppression will be taken away, and it says the zeal of the Lord will accomplish this. This term is only used 2 other times in the entire Old Testament, in Isaiah chapter 37 and in 2 Kings chapter 19. Both Isaiah chapter 37 and 2 Kings chapter 19 talk about the exact same event. King Hezekiah humbles himself and makes a prayer to the Lord to save his kingdom from the Assyrian oppression. Then Isaiah comes to him and he gives him the Lord's message. And he tells him what God will do, and he will save Israel. Hezekiah prays to God from verse 18 to verse 20, and after that, it goes on to describe how God will destroy the Assyrian armies. Then after describing how God will destroy the armies of the Assyrians and how God will save Israel, God says in verse 30, "This will be a sign for you, Hezekiah." In verse 32, it says, "For out of Jerusalem will come a remnant, and out of Mount Zion a band of survivors. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this." This is the exact same thing that says in Isaiah chapter 9. Now, in 2 Kings chapter 19, it says the exact same thing. Describes how King Hezekiah will humble himself. Hezekiah makes his prayer, and then Isaiah comes to Hezekiah to tell him how God will destroy the Assyrians, and it says the exact same thing. Verse 29, "This will be a sign for you, Hezekiah." Verse 31, "And out of Jerusalem will come a remnant, and out of Mount Zion a band of survivors. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this." This is what it describes in Isaiah chapter 9. Isaiah chapter 9 talks about how the Assyrian oppression will be lifted off of Israel, and Hezekiah is the son who will rule on the throne of David from that time, from the time of Isaiah, for a very long time. As I explained earlier, the term forevermore, both instances in verse 7 do not necessarily mean for eternity. The context is very clear. It is describing the Assyrian oppression and how God will miraculously lift this oppression off of Israel, and how Hezekiah will rule over Israel after that. So, recap, God sends the Assyrians as a punishment to northern Israel for disobeying God's commands. After the punishment is over, God removes the punishment from northern Israel. God destroys the Assyrians, and then northern Israel is no more. Then the one to sit on the throne of David is Hezekiah, and he sits on the throne of David and rules over Judah. The context makes it very clear that this is what Isaiah chapter 9 is about.